Okay, so moving on from our simple sender class, let's go ahead and create another class. We're going to call that simple listener. So let's go over to our project. Let's add a new class and let's call it simple listener. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to create a new UDP client that is just going to be listening for messages that are coming into a specific socket. Okay, so what we're going to end up doing is we're going to bind this client to a specific port on our computer, and all its purpose is going to be is to listen for incoming messages on that port and to translate them to something readable, some sort of readable data. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right in. The first method I want to do is when I create an instance of this class, it's going to have a reference to the actual UDP client that we are going to ultimately bind it to. So I'm going to call that my listener. And in order to keep a reference to the actual UDP client object, you need to make sure you include using system.net.sockets. I'm using a plugin for Visual Studio. I'm using ReSharper, which basically did the auto inclusion of that library as I began typing in UDP client. But for a lot of people, you may have missed it. So if I begin typing in private IP endpoint, then you're going to see my ReSharper plugin also go ahead and automatically include this when I press tab. There we go. And in this case, we're also going to end up keeping a local reference or a local variable copy to the remote endpoint port that we're going to be using. So what I mean by that is we're going to be using remote endpoint, the local variable, as a way to store the address and the port information for the location we're going to be binding this client to. That's going to be the incoming data client for our purposes, okay? After we've created these local variables, what I want to do is I want to create the actual method that will create the listener and bind it. So we're going to say a public void create listener. And this is just going to take an IP endpoint parameter, which will be the address and port that we want our client to open up on. So we're going to say at this point underscore my listener is equal to a new UDP client that we are opening on the endpoint EP. From there, I want to keep a copy of our endpoint just in case we ever want to reuse it by saying underscore remote endpoint is equal to EP. After that, we have successfully created our endpoint, which will ultimately be our listener. So if we were to create an instance of simple listener now, we can go over to our main method, and what we can actually do is we could say simple listener sp is equal to new simple listener, and we can actually create our listening socket by saying sp.createListener at a new IP endpoint, which for us is going to be IP endpoint IP address dot parse at quote 127.0.0.1. That is the IP address for our local host or our local computer. And the port we want to bind for listening to incoming messages is going to be 9001 for our project. Now, what you may be tempted to do at this point is go ahead and save and build your project and try to run it. Now you can absolutely do that, but you are not going to see anything exciting happen at this point because we're not actually sending any messages out, and we are definitely not receiving anything because we haven't told our listener to begin trying to receive data on our port yet. So the next step we're going to end up taking is we're going to go back to our simple listener, and we're going to create a very simple method which is going to, for our purposes, be a test method. It's going to be called public void listen test. And what our listen test method is going to do is it's going to actually send a message using our simple sender class and the send message method we wrote. It's going to it's going to use our client and begin receiving data on port 9001, which we're going to specify in a few moments. And then it's going to print that out to the console so that we can see that message that we received, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call simple sender.sendMessage, which is the method we wrote in our simple sender class that takes a byte array of data and it sends it to an IP endpoint destination, which we defined, okay? And in this case, what I want to do is I want to send a simple hello world string. So I'm going to say string str is equal to hello world for our test. I'm going to convert it to a byte array of data. And in this case, I'll make it a little bit more clear. This is going to be our string data. And the way I'm going to convert it is I'm going to use a .NET class called Encoding. I'm going to have it use the ASCII encoding. And I'm going to try to get the bytes from the string we just created. This should work flawlessly for everybody. But if you have an issue with using encoding, the first thing that you want to check out is if you're including the system.text namespace. That's going to be your key there to being able to use the encoding class. The next thing I'm going to do, now that we've saved our string into a byte array of data, is I'm going to pass that into our send message. So I'm going to say string data, which is our local variable, str data, and the remote endpoint is something I'm going to define as well as IP endpoint destination is equal to a new IP endpoint, which is going to be our local host 127.0.0.1 and on port 9001, because I am going to open up my listener to listen to data on port 9001 like we did in our main method. Okay, so at this point I'm going to say simple sender.sendMessage to destination. The last addition we're going to have for this test method is I want to tell my listener to begin receiving. And the way I'll do that is I'm going to say byte array of data is equal to my listener dot receive. What dot receive does is it tells our client, which we've already binded to port 9001, to block the thread that it's running on until it receives a complete message or until it receives that UDP packet. Okay? And what will end up happening here is we're going to go ahead and tell the computer to receive from the remote endpoint that's sending us the message. Okay? The last thing we're going to do is we're going to print out that data we just received in two different ways. We're going to do a, sorry, I was trying to use A different language there. What we're going to do is we're going to do a console.writeLine, and we're going to print out the actual string representation of the byte data we just received by using the bit converter class. And we're going to say toString, which will convert our byte data into a string form and print it out to our command to our console application. The next way we're actually going to convert this data and print it is we're going to do a console.writeLine, and instead of writing out the byte data converted to a string, we're going to convert the byte data to the actual ASCII string which we initially sent. Because we know we're receiving ASCII, we want to convert it back to it. And that's going to let us read the message as a string when we're done. So what we're going to do is we're going to say encoding.ASCII toString, get string from the byte array data we just received. We'll save, go ahead and build, and at this point what I want you to do is let's actually run this. Let's see if we actually receive the proper data. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a simple listener, which we've already made. We're going to call sp.listenTest and save, build, and then I want you to run it without debugging so that your console window stays open and you can see what just happened. So what we've done is in our main method we've created a simple listener. We have created the actual client, and then we've told it to send a message using our simple sender class and listen to it using the listener we just made. And if we actually look at our command our actual console application window, we can see that we received the actual byte data, which represents hello world, and then we also received if we convert that to ASCII, we actually received the string hello world, which is what we actually sent in our main method. In our listen test. And from there, what you guys can actually do is, if you wanted to modify this, we can actually create a listener that will continue listening on a loop and print out any data that it receives while running. And then we can also create a sender test, which will just be a looped method, which will just continuously be sending the same message until we stop the application. And the reason that we may want to do that is in a setting where we actually have real-time communication. We may not be running a listener and having it receive only one message. There are some application use cases where you will just receive one message or you're waiting for only one. But in a lot of cases, especially for running real-time communication, we want to receive data continuously, in which we may dedicate a thread just to listen on a specific socket. And what we may end up doing is we may create another thread which is just being used for sending. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to convert this very simple sender and very simple listener into something a little bit more practical. What we'll do is we'll add a listening loop, which is going to continuously receive and print out your data just for test. And then we're going to create a loop in our simple sender to continuously send out a message while we have the application running. And that will eventually lead you guys to having a basic framework and skeleton to be able to reuse for example, creating a Wi-Fi remote control. Something where you want to send data on an event based on like a button click or a trigger, and then it'll also show you how on another system you can open up a listener and receive the data that's being sent out from that controller. But we're not going to touch on that yet. We're going to first create those loops, and then we'll maybe work on a project like the Wi-Fi controller in our next series, which will be an intermediate UDP and TCP type learning project. Until then, stay tuned for the next video.